I just wanted to share with you today some learnings from a piece of work that I first got involved in about 18 months ago. And I was approached by the Environmental Defenders Office, who had a client, or actually three clients that they'd formed into one, who wanted to mount a case to protest against the development of the Waratah Coal mine in Queensland. And that was a small group of young adults in Queensland, a group representing a thing called the Bimblebox Reserve, which was a nature reserve which was quite likely to get seriously damaged by the coal mine had it gone ahead. And the third was a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And the Torres Strait Islanders, of course, were particularly concerned about the effect of climate change on their land. And I was asked, was there some way that I thought I might be able to help the court in Queensland, which had the power to hear this case, how we could demonstrate to the court what the quantity of cost would be on the state of Queensland, because being a Queensland court, the state of Queensland was what mattered, from progressing climate change going forward. And of course it was to others in the case to talk about, the fact that mining coal creates carbon emissions. And so that's probably the first interesting thing about this. This was very much a multidisciplinary exercise. There were a lot of lawyers involved. There were climate change experts, there were coal market experts, and there was me as the only actuary. So jumping to where that came out, towards the end of last year, we wound up with effectively a landmark judgement. It's the first legal case in Australia where a large new coal mine was simply told, sorry, you're not allowed to proceed. And the reasons given are quoted there, essentially involved what the court decided was an unacceptable climate change impact for the Queensland people and property after taking into account the positive economic and social benefits of the mine going ahead. And basically they came to the view that the burning of the Waratah coal overseas would cause environmental damage, worsen global climate change and limit the human rights of Indigenous people and children, interestingly, specifically referenced in Queensland. So they were that's sort of where we got to at the end. And just for context, the Waratah coal mine was a large coal mine, or would have been, about 4 times the size of the Adani mine, also in Queensland. And I should probably just say, in preface for those who are not Australian, the state of Queensland is the large state in the northeast corner of Queensland, immediately north of where we're holding this conference now. So the issues that I was asked to consider, and it was a bit daunting when we started, I have to say, is to work out what the future costs would be for all physical damage in Queensland arising from climate change, over and above what they already have, including the effect of cyclones, severe storms, floods, bushfires, drought, heat waves, sea level rise, and diseases known to be focused on or climate change impacted, such as dengue fever. They then wanted to know what are the costs of the deaths, hospitalisations and sickness arising from all of those as well, which was obviously quite a tall order. And we didn't manage to do all of it in the time available. I specifically started carving bits out because it was all getting a bit too hard. But I'll come back to that a bit later. And of course, there isn't a single, you can't predict with certainty for the next 80 or 100 years what the course of climate change will be. So the first thing we had to do was consider scenarios of, let's call it low, moderate and high climate change, and come up with 3 different answers according to those 3 key scenarios, so that the court could have a view of what the spectrum of the answers might be. So, in the process of putting their case to the court, and I should just mention here, for those of you who may not have done it, giving evidence in court is not for the faint-hearted. I fortunately, during my career, have done it a few times. Basically, what you have to remember is that the other side are going to make you try and look like an idiot, and therefore lose credibility with the judge and therefore not impact the judgment. So it's important not to allow that to happen. But that means you've got to be very careful, try not to make errors and try not to be an advocate for the case that you're putting forward. You have to be very objective and very careful. So with that background, the other side put forward, as they were required to do, a cost-benefit analysis, which was essentially a conventional net present value calculation that most actuaries would be familiar with. And the main problem with that was that they took the view that the costs of emissions were primarily so-called Scope 3 emissions. They did allow for Scope 1 and 2, for those of you who are familiar with the jargon. But Scope 3, of course, was by far the dominant number, like 95 or 6% of all the emissions. Were always going to occur offshore outside Australia. And they said, therefore, it's irrelevant to the state of Queensland. Of course, what I was being asked to quantify sort of made the assumption, well, Queensland's part of the world, therefore what affects the world might ultimately affect Queensland, and what is the cost of that? And that was a critical hinge point, if you like, in the way in which the judgment unfolded. So basically the Waratah Coal group put a value on their mine, a positive net present value of the development of between about 2.5 billion Australian dollars and about 4.1 billion Australian dollars, depending on what set of assumptions you may wish to choose around a whole different series of factors. In contrast, the numbers I started coming up with were more like, for the next 80 years, and expressed in dollars of the day, that is 2022 dollars, between a minimum of 5.4 billion and 19 billion on the hike scenario. So in other words, in 1 year, Queensland was going to suffer climate change costs, even on the minimum scenario, greater than the whole value of the entire Waratah Coal project, which was projected to keep mining coal for the next 30 or 40 years. Now, clearly it's not a fair comparison directly, because you're talking about one coal mine, admittedly a large one, versus all of the impact on the whole of Queensland. But nevertheless, you can see from the numbers there is a huge difference. And I believe this is the first time that anybody actually managed to quantify what is the cost of climate change in any shape or form for a state of Australia. And the court basically looked at those numbers and thought, we think we might have a problem here. And so you saw the judgment that came out of that. One of the really interesting things about this piece of work for me was that, as many of you know, I've been in and around the space of climate change for the best part of 20 years now, but I learned quite a lot as a result of doing this job. And so I thought I'd share some of those learnings a bit more with you today. First thing is, Queensland is definitely the state in Australia that is by far the most exposed to climate change of any of the others. So in a funny sort of way, we're a bit lucky that the coal mine was in Queensland and not New South Wales, because New South Wales is not nearly as exposed to climate change, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Second major learning was that actually one of the major drivers of the costs in Queensland will be the excess or early deaths that we see from heat waves. It's a significant driver of, and indeed it's a larger driver than the physical costs of things like cyclones, etc. And the other one which came out, which was actually as a result of some studies done centred on the University of Tasmania, there were a number of people involved in it, was a study following the Australian experience of the 2019 bushfires, where in essence what we now know is that for every one person who actually dies in a bushfire, there's about 13 who die within a couple of months as a direct result of the smoke inhalation and associated health impacts. So even though 33 people died directly in the bushfires, there were over 400 who died caused by the bushfires through basically cardiovascular or lung complaints. So when we get down into a little more detail, I talked earlier about scenarios. The scenarios we actually used are set out on that slide, and I won't go through them in great detail, other than to say they are based on the International Panel of Climate Change scenarios, particularly from the 5th and 6th assessment reports. The various RCPs refer to the concentration of carbon over time in the atmosphere, And you can basically characterise them as the Paris scenario, which is pretty much the lowest we can reasonably expect, I think, in simple terms these days, a moderate, an intermediate and a high scenario, and it was essentially the difference in costs between those three scenarios. That is, assume Paris is a given, what is the increase above that? So what we were quantifying was not the total climate cost, it's simply the climate cost over and above what we now expect broadly around the Paris scenario of each of the moderate, the intermediate and the fossil fuel scenarios. So the justification, in essence, for taking that approach rested on the fact that the International Energy Agency did put out a report in 2021 which basically said there is a realistic scenario whereby we can satisfy all of the projected energy needs of the world going forward for many years, but without opening any new coal mines anywhere in the world. And so that might be described as the global transition scenario. There's a lot of detail put in that report. The IEA, by the way, is an intergovernmental agency made up of about 20 mainly developed country governments, but it does include obviously input from some of the major energy producers, fossil fuel energy producers. And so that basically was, we were able to say to the court, well, that report clearly says that can be done, and therefore there is no reason why a new coal mine needs to be built simply to satisfy the demands for energy that we know will come. Obviously increasing demands with energy as the population of the world increases. So that enabled us to basically say, well, we don't need to have a new coal mine, therefore we can establish that these will be the costs that could be avoided to some extent by not having that particular new coal mine. I then, as a matter of methodology, started to be a bit deliberately conservative with some of the estimates, perhaps not very actuarial, but nevertheless I wanted to make sure that the other side would not be able to say that we had over-dramatised the situation or were exaggerating, and therefore maintain credibility with the court. And so some of the things that were actually going to be harder to estimate at that time, although some of them are probably certainly capable of being estimated with a bit more time and money, were things like the costs of hospitalisations from injuries caused by the climate risks. We didn't include those. The cost of disease, similarly, was going to be too hard at the time, so we left that out as well. But even without that, some of the estimates were deliberately set up on a slightly conservative basis, and I can talk a bit more about that in question and answer if people are interested in the details. And finally, I made a philosophical decision fairly early on that I didn't want to try to calculate single net present values, because I knew that if I did that, because we were talking about projections 80 years into the future, that could easily boil down to a big argument about discount rates and inflation rates and what was appropriate and what was socially justified. And I wanted to try to keep this relatively easy for a court to understand. So I talked all the time about the equivalent annual cost of the scenarios that we were talking about, on the broad assumption that they would obviously be expected to increase broadly with inflation. And that made those costs be capable of being expressed then as dollars per person in Queensland and dollars or as percentages of the Queensland state domestic product, which people I think found much more easier to understand and comprehend than single net present values. There were quite a lot of information sources that I needed for this report to do this. And I'm not going to go through and list all of them there, although I should acknowledge Munich Re. Obviously I have a connection with Munich Re, but they were very helpful in being able to provide not only estimates of catastrophe costs in Queensland now, but they also do have models which obviously with increasing funnels of doubt owing to the future predict what they think the climate change catastrophe costs will be quite a few years into the future all around the world. And obviously for the part of the modelling that we were doing around catastrophe costs and cyclones and storms and bushfires, that was really quite useful. But of course a lot of the other work that I was using even Munich Re wasn't able to help with much. So we got into a whole lot of work on sea level rise that was originally done by the Australian Department of Climate Change. The Queensland government themselves had already done in 2019 a state heatwave risk assessment report, which was extremely interesting and useful. And that in turn had been based upon some quite detailed academic studies that had been done during the time of the Garneau report in Australia in the mid-2010s. So interestingly, a lot of that work could be relatively easily referenced if you knew where to go and find it, but assembling it all in one place and making it coherent and getting a simplified set of assumptions together wasn't easy, but it was basically, didn't involve a lot of modelling, but it did involve quite a lot of adding up and consistency checking and making sure that the assumptions were sensible and could be presented. One of the things I mentioned earlier is Queensland is by far the most sub-state subject to climate change risk in Australia. That is a graph that did actually come broadly from Munich Re. It just shows you the percentage of residential properties with significant climate risk in Australia, which is predominantly driven by cyclone and storm, but also by sea level rise, all of which are overrepresented in Queensland for various reasons. And of course, heat waves are a particular risk in Queensland, given that it is basically a hot place already. I'll come back to why heat waves are a big issue a bit later. I suppose that one of the learnings here is that a lot of the work that had been done up until now was highly generalised and it basically just talks about climate change risk for Australia. And I think the important message here is, and it's I'm sure true in many other countries, Australia is a fairly large place and the climate change risk is very different if you're in Tasmania compared to if you're in Queensland, not to put too fine a point on it. And it has obviously something to do with latitude and how close you are to the equator. You know, if you're just doing a broad brush approach on a portfolio, you'll miss a hell of a lot of the detail that you really need when you start asking yourself, well, what is the real climate change risk? It needs to be thought about pretty carefully at an individual geographic level. Just to give you some idea of the concentration of the total heatwave risk in the total numbers, I've just given you, these are the projected deaths from heat waves according to the academic work that was done for the Garneau review, which I also did review myself in detail because it turned out to be quite an important foundational piece. And for reasons that I won't go into now, it turned out that what we actually used, which was quite deliberate, was about 90% of the actual risk from heat waves that we thought was going to happen in Queensland, because we just thought the numbers were so large it wouldn't hurt to have a little bit of a margin in there for conservatism. But that represents you know, quite a large, or the fact that obviously we're talking about possibly by 2100, you know, more than 10,000 deaths per annum in Queensland from heat waves alone. It's a big number. It's a lot more than people that got killed by COVID in Australia. So, you know, that does start to focus the mind a bit. And it's not just older deaths, of course, it does include deaths likely in heat waves from young children as well. It is something not to be forgotten about, let me put it that way. But to give you some idea of the importance of that in the overall estimated costs, that slide just sets it out there, and you can see the cyclone, storm, flood and sea level rise actually sort of pale a bit into insignificance in the total. Bushfire, heat waves and droughts are certainly bad, but the really bad number is the people dying, mainly from heat waves. And of course, to do that, being an actuary, you know, we basically used the value of statistical life as published by the Prime Minister's Office of Australia based on a methodology they adopted, perfectly sound piece of actuarial work. But it did allow us to obviously put a value on that loss of life and product, and just, which obviously reflects the loss of productive life of those people. And as I mentioned earlier, we were then able to turn that into something a bit more meaningful. The costs turned out to be either about $1,000 per person at minimum, up to $3,000 to $4,000 per person minimum. in Queensland per annum, or 1.5% to 5% of Queensland state gross domestic product. Obviously, the court felt that they're pretty material costs, and they are. I also mentioned briefly the chronic human cost of bushfires. There are quite a number of studies here, not just one now, that actually back this up. All sorts of evidence that's been emerging about what I think had been previously not very well recognised at all, around the increased levels of cardiac arrests, respiratory problems, and increased hospital presentations, particularly for asthma, for people exposed to smoke out of bushfires, particularly the sort of bushfires we had here in 2019. So I won't go on to all the detail of that here now. You can read very quickly there on the slide some of the detail of that, but it is actually quite an important lesson that came out of this. And of course, that's not just Queensland specific. Bushfires are a problem in every state of Australia and in many other places as well. And so it's one of the things that has really only emerged in relatively recent times about some of the costs that we are going to have to face as we continue to deal with the problem of climate change. So I think that just about concludes the initial comments I wanted to make. I hope you found that helpful. And
yes.
I guess we'll move to Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So in keeping with the usual structure of those sessions, we'll start with some specific questions for Tony, and then maybe broaden the scope to a wider roundtable or discussion. So there's a couple of questions directly for you, Tony. First one we received was, do you have any insight why Waratah was blocked by the court, but Adani allowed to go ahead?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Adani and another major mine a couple of years before it, which the name escapes me at the moment, but anyway, one of the main reasons was that the Queensland government, between those two decisions of the court, passed a human rights law. And the court actually found that to be material in their thinking because it allowed them to consider actively the submissions that have been put in front of it on behalf of the children, and particularly the Indigenous peoples and the Torres Strait Islanders, because they were arguing that under the Human Rights Act, their human rights were being oppressed, I suppose is a suitable word, particularly for the Torres Strait Islanders, who essentially their whole culture gets wiped out and they have to move as a result of the benefits of, not the benefits of climate change, but the impacts of climate change. So the court was able to use that as an anchor for its own legal thinking in the Waratah case, but not in the Adani case, because the Act hadn't been passed by the Queensland Parliament when Adani was being considered. I think that's probably the main reason for the difference in outcome between the two. I could, of course, also point out that no one had quantified the costs of climate change in the Adani case, and I think in the Waratah case, the sheer magnitude of those costs was become evident. I think the other major reason probably is, not that it would have affected Queensland's thinking quite so much, but clearly I think in 2019 when we had the bushfires here in Australia, I think my own personal judgment is that was probably a bit of a turning point in the minds of a lot of people about, gee, this climate change thing, it's actually real. I think there had been a lot of doubts and dispute before then as to whether it really mattered. But I think the bulk of the population finally began to get the message that actually this is serious and it is real as a result of those, because of the magnitude of those fires. That's just a personal view.
Yeah, thank you. The related question, I'm going to reformulate a bit because you already somewhat answered it. But did you have a specific cost suppose in dollars, to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
No, is the short answer. This was a total Queensland cost, which obviously does include the Torres Strait Islands. That is part of Queensland.
Yeah. And another interesting question, was there any criticism of methodology on the grounds of quantifying the total cost of climate change to Queensland rather than the marginal impact of that particular mine?
Fascinatingly, there wasn't. I was expecting it. But no, it didn't happen. I don't know why, but it didn't, and the court didn't seem to worry about it either.
And yeah, so interesting. So do you believe that this case should form a precedent for the opening of new mines more broadly across Australia?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt. It's a huge precedent. It was a landmark case, yes.
How long did it take you to quantify costs in this way?
Oh, God. It's about 3 to 4 months of solid full-time work.
Okay, yeah. Well worth it. And if you did this again, would you do anything differently?
That's an interesting question. It would have been nice to have a little bit more resources, because this was pretty much a one-man band effort, I have to say, to do it. I must have been a bit slightly crazy to take it on, perhaps, but because it was a fairly daunting task when you first realise what you're taking on. Yeah. As I said before, there were a number of deliberately conservative approximations put in there. There were a number of things that we just didn't have time, or I didn't have time to properly consider in the development of the case. You could always go back and do things a bit better if you have another crack at it, I guess, but I was quite comfortable with the work I had done, and I thought it was very defendable, and clearly the court thought that, because in the end they did, the judgement very specifically, relies is probably too strong a word, but it references my work very explicitly and quite extensively.
Yeah. So a bit more on that on the court. Were there arguments, and which were those that you ultimately have to explain or defend as part of the court case? And a following-up question is, given the success of the case, where do you think future defences of new fossil fuel ventures might focus on? So were you challenged on anything, and what do you think are the best things to focus on in future cases?
Yeah, one of the really interesting things was, as I mentioned earlier, I was the only actuary involved. For the other side, for reasons I do not understand, quite honestly, the normal thing would be to hire another actuary and make them comment on my work in this situation. And indeed, there were quite a lot of climate change specialists retained on both sides. They had lots of arguments, and obviously my work had to be integrated quite heavily with their work to make it all make sense. There were quite a lot of economists on both sides arguing about things like net present values and discount rates, etc., which fortunately I managed to dodge around, as I mentioned earlier. And there were, interestingly, opposing coal market experts on both sides. And I had to work fairly closely with the one on our side to make sure that the case was coherent and I wasn't saying something that would upset what she was saying. A lot of that boiled down to a question of substitutability. That is, if this mine doesn't go ahead, then some other mine will, and therefore you haven't achieved anything by stopping this mine, which was a very strong part of Waratah Coal's argument. Fortunately, at the end, the court finally said, well, this is a very large mine, and we just don't think we can sustain that argument in this case. Which was a major part of why Dani got up as well, by the way, that substitutability argument. The lawyers worked very hard on making sure that they could counter that argument effectively. I think this was a fairly specific set of circumstances. It would be dangerous to generalise, I think, into other fossil fuel resource developments in other places. But clearly there are some precedents that have been established here now that will have to be taken into account in the way the law works going forward in other places, certainly in Australia.
Yeah. So the direct question actually on this is, Do you think the same approach could be used for new gas exploration in Western Australia?
The short answer, I think, is yes. I mean, you might get a different answer, but bearing in mind West Australia is a very different cup of tea to Queensland, and of course that was a quirk of the way in which the law worked. We had to focus on Queensland because the Queensland Law Court, that's all they're allowed to, Land Court, that's all they're allowed to focus on, literally. I mean, in the way they've been established under law. I think it's interesting, though, just as an aside, for those of you who don't know, the Waratah Coal mine was owned, was promoted by Clive Palmer, who's a well-known entrepreneur and politician in Australia, who comes from the far right, I think it'd be fair to say. The Queensland government, of course, is a Labor government at the present time. It's anything but a far-right government. It is within the power of the Queensland government, if they wish, to directly overrule the court. But it's now been 8 months since the court judgment, and although the Waratah Coal have said they're going to appeal, the Queensland government have not exercised their right, and I suspect are never likely to, given the political orientation of the ownership, to overrule the court. So I think it is going to become a precedent, a landmark precedent. That's probably a simple answer to your question.
So maybe a couple more questions on this specifically before we go to a round table. From a professional perspective, I suppose in the process, did you have a peer reviewer? And maybe I'll combine that in what response did you have to this judgment and your role in it from colleagues in the insurance industry?
I did have a peer reviewer. I'd rather not say who they were at this stage, but yes, I did get someone to cast an eye over it for common sense. Just that seemed like a sensible precaution on my part.
Yeah.
General reaction. I think a lot of people were pleased to see the judgment, let me put it that way. Obviously there will be some people who weren't. That's in the nature of these things. But, Munich Re, for example, already have a policy of not financing new coal mines and have had it in place for some time now. So that wasn't controversial from their point of view. And that's global policy, of course. So I think I didn't see a lot of negative reaction, let me put it that way, from people in the industry.
Okay, great. I think that there are a few more questions, and some are quite specific, so I encourage you to look at them. If you don't have the time to cover them today, there might be a couple of questions you could follow up with
maybe
afterwards.
If someone can make sure I can get access to them. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we can organise that afterwards.